Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending where you are in the world, and welcome to our June complimentary webinar, Chemical Regulation in the Middle East. For those of you who have been on the webinars before, you'll know that I generally do these, or I have exclusively done them live, and we take questions in real time in the chat box. But today, I had an authority down in Peru who absolutely positively the only time they can talk to me about my client's food contact application there is at 10 o'clock Eastern time, which is where I am in Atlanta, Georgia, which is the exact same time this webinar is scheduled. So we're trying something new this time, and I have the capability, I'm told, this is the first time I'm using it, I have the capability to record the webinar in advance and then have it play at the appointed time, again, 10 o'clock in the morning, US Eastern time. So we're going to try it, and since I won't have the chat box active, please feel free to send me questions afterwards. I believe there's an option, and again, I apologize. I'm doing this for the first time, and if it wasn't last minute, I would have planned it a little bit better. But I believe you can still enter questions in the chat box, and I can go back after the recording plays at the automated time and review them and respond to you individually. But I would say, just to be safe, because again, I'm learning this part of it as I go, I would, if you want to do that, that's fine, but also send me your questions by email and I'll make sure I have a direct response to you then. So let's go ahead and get started on this one. And for those of you that haven't had an opportunity to meet me, or that I haven't had an opportunity to introduce myself, I'm the principal and director of M4 Global Consulting, LLC. It was founded in 2009. Prior to that, and actually during that position as well, and real quick, I apologize, at least on my screen, the font is different than I usually present, and the font is different than how I uploaded it. So just know that when I send you the PDFs afterwards and the recording afterwards, which again, if you're new, I do both of those things, the font will be fixed and you'll have the recording available as well. So as part of that, I've spent 25 years in global chemical companies and consumer product companies as both manager and director of their regulatory departments. And the reason I highlight that particularly is because I think one of the things that our company brings to you as a third-party consultant is that we, and especially I in this case, along with others, have very specific knowledge of how the chemical industry and how the consumer product industry works. This is from my experience in the consulting industry, and that's all it is. It's not judgmental. It's just my experience in the consulting industry elsewhere, is that you tend to have people that maybe haven't worked in industry or haven't worked in industry as deeply or as long, and they can tell you certainly what the regulations are, and they can be very competent. The people I know in the consulting industry are extremely competent. But they don't necessarily understand the interaction of how the regulation might play into your actual your situation in particular. So for example, when they say a regulation says this substance is banned in the country that you're going to be looking at, and you company need to find another way about it. My experience that I bring to the table, coming from those types of companies where I've been the regulatory director and I've had the ability to sit with marketing, sales, R&D, purchasing, supply chain, and understand from their point of view what's involved in the statement like that, and changing suppliers and changing raw materials and getting things qualified. So I bring that very unique background, I think, to you on the consulting side, in addition to knowing the regulations very well, is to say, here's how I've handled something like that in my previous companies, and maybe this is something that would work for you to help meet the regulatory compliance goal. As you see here, I've also published over a dozen peer-reviewed journal articles, and I have 2 books on chemical regulations, one on the European Union's Eco-Management and Audit Scheme, and then one that we'll talk about very briefly in my shameless plug at the end of the webinar there for chemical regulation in the Middle East. And sure, I would certainly love you to at least look at it, if not purchase it, but I also say that because I think it's a very good handbook. I designed it that way to be very easy to read. There's a chapter on each of several countries, more than we'll go into in the presentation, and everything is broken down. I tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. So you have every chapter set up the same way. You have the competent authority. You have the chemical regulations applicable to, industrial and institutional chemicals. You have biocide regulations. You have safety data sheet regulations. You have workplace safety regulations, all very clearly laid out, I believe, to help you in your compliance goals in the region. And then finally, I've had an opportunity to speak at several different places around the world on the topics of Latin America and Middle Eastern chemical regulations. So with that introduction having been said, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do, or I like to do when I talk about the Middle East, is give you an overview of the Middle Eastern chemical regulatory environment. And the reason I think that's particularly useful is because when we most of us, or myself, of course, being here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, and primarily working in the United States for my career, and also other people I've known in industry and other clients I've had in industry, we tend to focus on how regulations are set up in our particular area of the world. So when you're talking about an EU regulation, for example, you will see regulations in the EU set up in a particular word format. Let's just call it that. In the United States, you see something different. When we talk about TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, it doesn't have the title regulation, and it doesn't have the title, a number in the title of the regulation, like, for example, the EU does. So I want everybody to be on the same page and understand how you actually find the regulations in these countries we're going to talk about, and how you actually understand the title. Because in certain cases, as I look at, some of those regulations will just say Resolution number 4 of 2006. And it won't tell you in the description what the actual regulation itself is. Whereas in the previous example, the Toxic Substances Control Act tells you that is what it regulates in the United States. And again, that'll hopefully become clearer as we move through the presentation. The 4 countries that we're going to look at today, and I want to stress when I give this presentation each time, that this is not to say these are the only 4 countries that have chemical and consumer product regulations in place. That's absolutely not true. They are 4 countries in the region that have very specific regulations in place, and or have very specific regulations coming on board shortly that I think you need to be aware of. So again, just because Israel, that's a perfect example actually, just because Israel is not on this list, and for the sake of time, they have a new regulation actually in process now of being phased in for chemical substance notification. And you can certainly drop me an email, give me a call. I'll be happy to talk with you and actually give you the presentation I did on that earlier this year. They have that coming out shortly. So just because we're not talking about it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at the moment. So again, just be very cautious when you're looking at the presentation from that point of view. And finally, we're going to look at 3 specific future opportunities and challenges relating to the Middle East. And again, I've purposely not included Israel because that is literally a 45-minute presentation I did because of the intricacies and the nuances of that regulation. Really need to spend some time on, much more than I could in 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever we're doing here with these other countries. So generally speaking, as you see here, when it comes to Middle Eastern countries, they tend to manage their substances differently from the EU, from the United States, from Japan, from Korea, places like that, in the sense that they use permits and they use licenses. Whereas again, and I apologize, I try to make it global, but I just automatically default to the United States, being here and working here for most of my career. We have, for TSCA, the positive list. Generally speaking, you need to be on that list or exempt from having to be on that list in order to manufacture or import your substance into the United States. Middle Eastern countries don't work that way, generally speaking, partly because a lot of them don't have chemical inventories in place. So there really isn't anywhere to look for, is my substance notified? Do I need to notify it? Things like that. But again, be careful. We'll see that with partly in Saudi Arabia, that's actually not the case. And they tend to regulate things based on your application. So I'm going to bring in methyl ethyl death, and I decide I want to use it in a country in Europe. Generally speaking, I need to get a license for that particular use from the competent authority. And as we'll talk about repeatedly in this presentation, there can be many different competent authorities who either have or may assert that they have jurisdiction over your product. Similarly, for things that are considered usually hazardous or toxic or so on, you may have to get a separate permit, which is different from a license. And I want to make sure everybody watching understands that clearly. Licenses and permits are not synonyms. They are not the same word. Licenses and permits are different from each other. Sometimes you may need one, sometimes you may need both, depending on the situation, but they are not the same term. Secondly, again, specifically to what we're used to seeing in the EU, and we're also seeing in South America with Mercosur and the Andean community, there is a trading bloc in the Middle East, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, and you'll see that abbreviated GCC as we go throughout the presentation. The important thing to know about the GCC compared to, for example, the EU, is not all countries in the GCC not all countries in the EU are members of the GCC. Whereas generally speaking, when you're talking about the European Union, I haven't looked recently, and I apologize to my European colleagues, all 27, 28 countries of the EU are in consider the EU trade bloc, although now I guess with Britain, the UK doing some different things and having Brexit, maybe that's not completely an accurate statement, but you understand hopefully generally where I'm going with that. So only these member states that you see identified here, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, and Bahrain, are members of the GCC. So when we talk later on about GCC regulations, only those countries are obligated by virtue of their membership to implement regulations from the GCC. And we'll talk about how they do that, because again, that's somewhat similar to how Europe does things with resolutions versus directives and things like that. So when you're looking at this list, again, we say, for example, Israel is not on the list as a member state of the GCC. So according to member state regulations, GCC member state regulations, Israel does not have to implement the regulations that the GCC puts forward. They can certainly choose to, but they're not bound to do that, whereas these other countries are. And again, we'll talk about it, as I said a moment ago, where the countries have to transpose the regulations into their national law. Again, very similar to how Europe does it with, again, regulations and directives. They're not automatically binding. I shouldn't say that. They are binding on the member states of the GCC. However, the GCC states, countries individually have to transpose them, put them into their national law. So they're binding, but they're not really binding until they become part of the national law in the country, if hopefully that makes any sense. And one of the things that you'll see is some cities in countries in the Middle East have their own very specific regulations. And we're going to see that a little bit with Pakistan and certainly with Saudi Arabia, where you can make the blanket statement that generally speaking, Saudi Arabia does not have a chemical inventory, does not have a chemical notification scheme. However, two specific cities, as we'll see, in Saudi Arabia do have both chemical regulation and chemical notification schemes, as well as a safety data sheet requirement that Saudi Arabia as a whole does not. So I always say, when I give any kind of regulatory presentation about Latin America and the Southeast, I always say, know who you need to talk to, because as I said earlier, sometimes there may be more than one authority who has jurisdiction over your product or thinks they have jurisdiction over your product, and you may need to convince them that that's not the case. Same thing here. There may be cities and markets where you're going into where there are rules that don't otherwise apply in the country as a whole. So when we first talk about with Bahrain, again, and I've said it before and I'll continue to say it, several ministries and different related bodies have jurisdiction over chemical substance products in Bahrain. The Supreme Council is the competent authority, and we'll see that abbreviated CA throughout the presentation, for the environmental protection. And that's interesting because it's maybe a bit convoluted to our maybe Western way of thinking. You would say, well, the competent authority, the Supreme Council, has responsibility for protecting the environment in Bahrain by statute, by legislation. So you wouldn't necessarily think that they have responsibility for chemicals management, because you'd say, well, environmental management generally would be air permitting, water permitting, land use restrictions if they are involved, things like that. But in Bahrain, the competent authority has taken it upon themselves to say that we believe that we have the authority, and they have demonstrated the authority, to manage chemical substances based on the fact that their job or their mandate is to protect the environment in Bahrain. We talked before about licensing and permits. The Ministry of Municipalities and Urban Planning is the one you would have to go before to get a license in order to import what they call special chemicals for combating insects and parasites. Translation, pesticides. There we're not talking, and again, this is out of the scope. It's a little bit too involved for the time frame we have. We're not talking about consumer use pesticides. There we're talking about insects and parasites being external, being agriculture use, being commercial, industrial, institutional, not consumer products. Bahrain presently has no chemical substance inventory or notification scheme. So you don't need to make a pre-notification to the authority. There's no positive list of substances. There can be restricted lists, and we'll talk about that shortly. But there isn't generally a list the way we think of, again, with TSCA or Canada in the U.S. Environment Canada, or now it's called what? Environment. Something, they just changed their name, Environment Canada and Climate Change, something like that in Canada. And I apologize to my Canadian colleagues. I haven't worked in Canada in quite a bit of time, so I'm a little fuzzy on the name, but I know they changed it. So maybe I'll get a point for that. So again, there's no chemical inventory, no chemical notification scheme. However, as you see here, prior to importing the substance, there is a specific application form that you must complete and you must give to Ministry of Industry, Commerce, and Tourism's special subdivision. So when I get asked the question, does Bahrain have a national inventory? The answer, as you see here, is no. And then people say, oh, great, I have nothing left to do. I'm good to import. And I say, well, you have to complete this particular form and give it to the ministry before you import the substance. And they say, well, you said there's no inventory. And I say, I understand that there is no inventory, but you still have to do a notification, which understandably confuses a lot of people because we tend to associate inventory and notification as step one and step two in an import process or a manufacture process. Bahrain manages the import, use, and misuse, they call it, of toxic chemicals, as well as the licensing of, and I apologize, I've done this half a dozen times now, these webinars, and for whatever reason, it doesn't like the font and it doesn't like keeping things the way they are supposed to be on the slide, so it's cut off. But again, in the PDFs you'll get, everything will look just the way it should. So they manage specific uses for industrial establishments, laboratories, and the phrase that's cut off is chemical warehouses. So in warehouses, chemical storage facilities. So there they have a special license separate from the license that we've talked about elsewhere for these specific facilities. So if you remember in the beginning, I said that countries in Middle East, generally speaking, use licenses and use permits to manage chemical substances. Here they're using a licensing structure to manage particular facilities, industrial establishments, laboratories, chemical warehouses. So again, I know the terms are very similar, and I try to keep highlighting that. Always know what you're talking about, because if you start to conflate or put two terms together that aren't the same, you might get yourself in a little bit of confusion. In Bahrain, there are two main resolutions that talk about chemical substance management. The main one is 2002, as you see here, resolution number 7, entitled On the Control of the Importation and Use of Prohibited and Severely Restricted Chemical Substances. And that does exactly what you might think it does. It sets out a specific list of substances that are either restricted or banned for use or import into the country. So again, no national inventory, but you have to look at resolution number 7 from 2002 to see perhaps you can't manufacture or import your product into Bahrain. Most of the substances on there, as you see, are those that have been proven to be highly dangerous, and proven is my emphasis, by regional and international organizations, generally speaking. You see the caveats in there as well. But so, for example, NIOSH or World Health Organization or things like that have decided that these substances are proven to be highly dangerous. The reason I call that out is because when we're talking about highly dangerous, most of you in industry have at least heard of, if not worked with, the terms that I just drew a blank on. Known carcinogens and suspect carcinogens. I apologize. According to resolution number 7, suspect carcinogens are not included in the resolution, because they have not been proven. They are, as I just said, suspect. There's some correlation that people see. There's some data that people see that say, we think this could cause cancer, but because they are not actually proven to cause cancer or known to cause cancer, they would not be included on resolution number 7 from 2002. So be aware of that. Resolution number 4 from 2006 is titled On the Management of Hazardous Chemicals. So this is a different regulation, obviously, in terms of year and terms of number. Before, we're talking about importing and using prohibited and restricted chemicals. This is talking about hazardous chemicals, and the definition of hazardous chemicals is in the regulation. And it talks about the things that you see here. So the proper handling, storage, import, export, transport of chemical substances. I kind of misspoke earlier. I said 2002's number 7 was the main one you need to focus on, and I misspoke. I should have said 2006's resolution number 4 is the main one to focus on, because that tells you how to do the stuff you need to do. Resolution number 7 is important because it'll tell you, can you do that stuff with your substance or not? So again, I misspoke. I had them backwards. 2006 is the one you really want to pay attention to, but don't forget 2002 as well. In Bahrain, when we talk about agricultural pesticides, remember we touched on them briefly a little bit before, but not specifically ag pesticides. Division of Plant Protection is the agency that's going to assert jurisdiction over these types of ag pesticides. And again, you'll see that they have regulations in place, so we really won't go into too much because, again, this is a whole nother 30-minute presentation on Bahrain. And also issuing licenses when it comes to importing of your ag chemicals, so your fertilizers, your pesticides, things like that. Legislative Decree number 11 of 1989 is the statute governing pesticide management in Bahrain. And I always want to point this out because I probably didn't word it in the clearest way. The first part talks about Division of Plant Protection, and that's specific to ag pesticides. Legislative Decree number 11 from 1989 talks about pesticides in general in Bahrain. So there is a section that talks about ag pesticides, but it's also there talking about consumer products and consumer pesticide products, industrial and institutional pesticide products, things like that. So don't conflate the two. Don't put the two together that Legislative Decree number 9 only talks about the ag pesticides, because that's what comes in the line above it. That's, I guess the next time I do this presentation, I should make that clearer in terms of the terms I use. And then just giving you some information here on Decree number 11, you see all the various categories that it covers. So synthetic and natural compounds. Some of us that work in certain areas of the globe are not used to natural chemical compounds being regulated under pesticide regulation. Here in Bahrain, they are to at least some degree. Again, use and licensing, again, specific to ag pesticides, but also the regulation is to the larger pesticide component as well. And just to save you a little bit of time, if you're pulling up Decree 11 and you don't have the time to go through it all, or you want to go to the specific section that you need to worry about, here you see 5 different bullet points of the sections, or the articles as they're called, where you can find information. So if you want to know how do I register a product in Bahrain, which is a pesticide, I would go to Article 8, registration. Then I would also argue that you should go to Articles 9 through 12 in order to make sure you have the appropriate licenses that you might need. A little bit of delay here on our presentation. There we go. Okay, moving now to Egypt. So we've talked about Bahrain, obviously. In Egypt, there are 7 ministries involving permits relating to chemical substances. And this is, I've said it before, I'll say it again, know who you need to talk to. And I tried to break it down as clearly as possible here in these 7 items for you. Because, for example, if you have what's considered to be a hazardous industrial substance, you, as you see here, would likely go before the Ministry of Industry. However, if, depending on the jurisdiction you have, or people who are asserting jurisdiction, sometimes I have this conflict where I'm in Egypt and I'm talking to authorities, and they both say, we have requirements, and one says this is the requirement, and one says this is a requirement, and there's no overlap. So we've had interesting discussions with the Egyptian authorities there. But again, to follow that example out, hazardous industrial substances, Ministry of Industry, but other types of hazardous substances and waste, because you talked about hazardous industrial substances and waste for Ministry of Industry, other types of hazardous substances and waste is the Ministry of Environmental Affairs. So you might have a dual use product. Well, I could use it in industry and it's a hazardous industrial substance, and it could conceivably be used in another environment, whatever it might be, depending on your product. And that would make it an other, by their terminology, hazardous substance. So again, in that example, you might have to go before Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Environmental Affairs, at least to have the conversation with them before you go any further. One may say, you know what, we don't assert jurisdiction in this particular case, we're fine. Other people may say that they do. Egypt, the main one that we talked about, the main law that we're going to talk about, kind of goes back to Bahrain, where I said, you know, you had the competent authority saying that protection of environment gave them the right to regulate chemicals. In Egypt, it's somewhat similar. Law number 4 from 1994 is the protection of the environment law. But again, the Egyptian authority, similar to Bahrain, has said, we're going to regulate chemicals in the country based on our mandate to protect the environment as per law number 4 of 94. Again, law number 4 of 94 is extremely comprehensive, not the least of which because it's in Arabic, but very, very long to read through. So I tried to give you the high points here. The main one to focus on is Article 25, because you see here, that's where you're going to find the requirements for your chemical substances, hazardous substances and hazardous waste definition. You're going to find that information starting in Article 25. And Article 25 is also going to talk about, as you see here, handling hazardous substance and waste shall be prohibited unless a permit has been issued by the competent body according to the type and the use of hazardous substance and waste. And I put that in there, kind of go back to what we were talking about in the beginning about how you have licenses and permits. Here, Article 25 in Egypt says specifically that you need to have a permit, but you cannot bring any product in unless you have the permit. So if you're thinking about doing trials, you're thinking about warehousing it, things like that, according to Article 25 of the regulation, you need to get the permit from the authority first. So R&D samples, things like that, no, not the way the regulation is currently written now. It's possible depending on your substance, and we've had this situation before where we've got the authority to say, you know what, it's an R&D purpose at a specific facility, it's not going to leave the facility, and they've said, okay, based on the nature of the hazard and things like that, we will grant you an exception. But as the regulation reads, that's not the case. Law number 21 of 1958, so we're going back quite a few years, almost 70 years there, and well, 65 years-ish, gives the Ministry of Industry the ability to establish specs for both raw materials and industrial products. And you pay very close attention to the next line you see here. Such specifications must be followed in the production of more than 150 commodities. So if you have one of those 150 commodities, you can't say, well, my raw material specification is 98% purity. And that's from my quality specs and my quality control measures at my manufacturing facility and maybe R&D, that's acceptable. That may be acceptable and that may not be acceptable if it's one of those 150 chemicals. And then also goes into industrial products. Those are more your commodity industrial products. I don't know if hydrogen peroxide is one of those, but that's an example that comes to my mind of you would have a commodity industrial chemical, and maybe not. I should probably look this up for the next time I give the presentation. I don't know if that is considered a regulated substance where you need to have specifications for it in Egypt. Then it goes a little bit further with law number 21 of 1957, tells that same ministry there have to be specs for specific types of chemicals and household commodities. So first it talks about specs followed in production of them. Then these are specifications for specific chemicals and household commodities as finished goods. So first one again is industrial production, raw materials and industrial production. Here we're talking about consumer and household goods. So pigments, dyes, food additives. We don't get into food additives in this presentation, but Egypt has a whole nother set of regulations talking about food additives and food contact and things like that. Soap detergents, maybe getting in a little bit of the cosmetics with perfumes, things like that. So just be, again, cognizant that when I say you have to talk to different industry ministries potentially, you absolutely need to do that in this particular case with Egypt. Egypt is interesting because when it comes to fertilizers and products, you have the Ministry of Agriculture and Labor Relations, and I don't think I put that acronym in. I need to fix that next time. They tend to govern those types of products, and the chief regulation when it comes to the ag pesticides part of it is Ministerial Decree number 1018 from 2013, which, as the name implies, maybe, concerning registration, handling, and use of ag pesticides in Egypt. The reason I like to cite this next bullet point, this website, and every time I do it, I have in the back of my mind saying, you know what, you're giving away a consulting trade secret that maybe you shouldn't do that. But APC has a really good website, and it's actually in English, or has a section in English, that talks, as you see here, that has all relevant information with regards to pesticides. So database for pesticides approved and recommended in Egypt, instructions for the safe use, information about the APC itself. So it's a really good resource. It's not exhaustive. So don't say, you know, if something's on there or not on there, I either have an obligation or I don't. But a lot of the countries, especially in the Middle East and certainly in South America, don't have anything like that. So I wanted to point that out, that that's a really good resource to at least take a minute and get yourself familiar with in Egypt. Article 1 of that obviously defines APC as the sole statutory agency responsible for the registration and handling, blah, blah. So that's where you get the responsibility, the mandate of who actually has responsibility for these products in country of Egypt. And then you talk a little bit further, talking about registration and licensing and permits, for example. Article 8 talks about doing any of those things is prohibited unless those pesticides are registered with APC according to procedures that are in the decree. So basically, you can't formulate, repack, produce, import, trade anything like that with with pesticides in Egypt unless they are registered according to APC with the requirements that APC puts forward in decree number 1018. So similar to Bahrain, you're talking about, I have a site-limited intermediate pesticide or for a field trial, let's say, or I have something like that. We've had a situation where Egypt has granted an exception, but generally speaking, the rule as it exists says that you can't do that. Further in Egypt, Egypt does not have a safety data sheet requirement. They have a concept, I guess you could say, called emergency response sheets, ERSs. And in practice, they are safety data sheets. They just don't call them safety data sheets. And safety data sheets are not mandated by your Egyptian regulation. However, they have the National Hazardous Substances Information and Management System, and it suggests, it doesn't require, it says directed. That's, for those of us that are used to at least European and United States regulations, when it says directed, that's kind of the shall, and I just realized that language is confusing. They say if you have an ERS, we would like you to submit it with the other requirement documentation you need to submit to the regulatory agency, but they are not required, primarily because ERSs as a statutory requirement don't exist in Egypt. Whereas like in the United States, for example, we have the HAZCOM 2012 regulation, and that required safety data sheets to be produced and produced in a certain way and classifications and all these other things. Egypt doesn't have that. So they're saying if you have this document, which we would call in Egypt an ERS, we would like you to submit it, but it's not mandatory. And you see some of the things that, generally speaking, from our experience in Egypt, what the ERSs that do exist, type of information they include. And it's very similar to something, again, under HAZCOM 2012, under, I don't recall if it's CLP in regulation when it talks about safety data sheets. I haven't worked on safety data sheets in Europe in a little bit, so I apologize to my European colleagues for not knowing that offhand. GHS has not been implemented in Egypt, and as of now, there are no plans to do so. So since there's no SDS requirement, you can use a GHS safety data sheet as long as it conforms to the requirements, the language, and so on, that, again, we don't go into right now because of time, in Egypt, but you don't have to because there is no, again, regulation in Europe specific to safety data sheets. Pakistan is another country that has some very unique regulations in place when it comes to chemical substances and chemical substance management. There are many agencies, again, competent authorities who have regulation. I want to draw a distinction because people tend to understandably get them confused because the acronyms are fairly similar. There's the Environmental Protection Agency in Pakistan, and they call it PAK-EPA, PAK-EPA, which is the competent authority, is the regulatory body. That was established under Section 5 of the Pakistan Environmental Protection Act, PEPA. So PAK-EPA is the competent authority that you would have a dialogue with. PEPA, PEPA, is the act, the regulation, the statute, the resolution that you need to look at, possibly in relation to having a discussion with the competent authority of PAK-EPA. In there, the act, you see, talks particularly in Section 2, what defines hazardous substances in Pakistan. And it talks about the properties of the physical properties and the chemical properties that impact that classification. Remember I said earlier, many countries have different competent authorities who assert or may assert jurisdiction. Pakistan does. You see here the Ministry of Environment, the Environmental Protection Agency, PAK-EPA, and the Ministry of Industry. They all assert jurisdiction and they all have different requirements, but they don't share information. So they don't have a central database of information in Pakistan relating to chemical substances. So I say that to say, just because you have to submit something potentially to PAK-EPA to have a registration move forward, if the Ministry of Industries decides that they have jurisdiction over your product, you can't say, for example, well, I submitted that to PAK-EPA. From our experience, they will say, that's wonderful, but you didn't submit it to us. So you need to send the data to us as part of your notification process or whatever we might be requiring. So I say that to say, first of all, be aware of that. And second, when you do hear that information, as we have heard repeatedly from Pakistani authorities, don't say, well, wait a minute, it doesn't make any sense. It's Pakistan, but that's how the authorities have been structured, at least up until this point. And then when you're reading through the Pakistan regulations, the other one thing I want to point out is don't get bogged down in the fact that there are over 50, there are actually 53 acts and regulations that talk about chemicals management in Pakistan. Most of them only have a very, very specific or very marginal or very tiny regulation to, generally speaking, the types of products that most global countries are going to be using and importing and manufacturing in Pakistan. That's not to say ignore those 53. I'm saying, generally speaking, they're very specific to certain uses, certain chemistries, certain application types. They aren't as overarching as, for example, PEPA, PEPA, yeah, PEPA. See, I'm even getting confused. PEPA might be. In Pakistan, similar to Egypt, there is no requirement for safety data sheets. Our experience in Pakistan, though, primarily working with European countries who want to go into Pakistan, we have found that international chemical safety cards are accepted. Again, there's no regulation, so you don't have to give them anything. But European countries have said, well, for whatever reason, I don't have a safety data sheet for this product. And actually, it's not just European, but it's when you talk about chemical safety cards or TREM cards or things like that, you tend to mainly look at Europe, from my experience. We don't have a safety data sheet for whatever reason, but we do have these international chemical safety cards. Can we submit those with our documentation to answer some of your questions? Generally speaking, Pakistan has said, yes, that's okay. We will accept those. Under the hazardous substances rules in Pakistan, Section 9, and I want to be very clear about this, Section 9 does present a form that may be completed for a lot of the data that you'll see on, again, European and United States safety data sheets. But again, I highlighted it to try to make it as clear as possible. It may be completed. You do not have to submit a completed Schedule 9 from the hazardous substances rule in order to bring or manufacture your product in Pakistan. Now, if you were hiring me as a consultant, I would probably say, well, you most likely have that data already to hand, because most of the regions of the world, generally speaking, South America is getting there, but they're not quite there yet as a whole. Most of the regions of the world have some form of safety data sheet requirements, if not GHS safety data sheet requirements. So I would say, if I was your consultant, if you have it, why not give it to them? If anything, it'll probably make your process a little bit smoother because you're giving them additional data that maybe they can feel a little more comfortable with as they're reviewing your products. Outside of chemical pesticides and pharmaceuticals, Pakistan does not have a universal system for labeling and marking of products. So in certain cases, consumer goods, you might have regulations for labeling and marking and so on. But other than chemical pesticides and pharma products, there is not a standard industrial chemical labeling resolution, act, statute, whatever you want to call it, most likely be a resolution in Pakistan. However, going back to, again, how we talked about the lack of requirement for safety data sheets, but my advice as a consultant to my clients is usually go ahead and submit the data on the safety data sheet if you have it, because it can only help your product, I believe, your process, I should say. In order to promote worker safety, and many companies of the world have tended to have good manufacturing practices in place, worker safety trainings, workplace safety programs in place. So that's a mindset that carries over to the culture of a lot of global companies. So they say, well, Pakistan may not have a requirement for chemical labeling in the workplace, but because we are good corporate citizens and maybe we have other legal requirements as well, we are going to label these chemicals pursuant to an other chemical standard. So we talked a little bit before about the CLP in Europe, possibly labeling according to the CLP in Europe, possibly to HAZCOM 2012 in the United States. The only thing to be aware of, I would say, is if you're going to do this, and I try to notify it here, is it's interesting because you need to have the hazard text provided in Urdu, which is the national language of Pakistan, or English. However, I mean, that's almost literally the extent of the regulatory guidance they give when it comes to product labels. Now, again, if I was hired as your consultant, and this is the second bit of free advice you might get on this webinar, I would say put it in both, because I always feel more comfortable telling clients, put it in the national language of the country, because the more than likely that's what people are going to speak. Yes, maybe some people relating to issues in the past with Britain and so on, maybe some people in Pakistan will speak English, but not necessarily. So I want to make sure, I always say, do it at least in the local language. And if you want to put English on there as well to help facilitate something else, go ahead and do that, but at least the national language. Finally, wrapping up, Saudi Arabia is particularly interesting because they do not require, as you see here, you to establish a local Saudi agent or distributor to sell products. A lot of us in the, again, certainly in South America where I do a lot of work, you need to have South American national, certainly to make the registration and also to be the importer of record for your products into South America. Saudi Arabia does not require that from a product sale point of view. However, their commercial regulations, so their import, export, their tariffs, their customs, things like that, restrict imports for resale and direct commercial marketing to Saudis and wholly Saudi-owned companies. So you don't need to have a Saudi distributor in place to sell your products into the market. But when it comes to other things relating to commercial, and again, import, export, tariffs, things like that, to Saudi nationals and Saudi wholly owned companies, then you do have an obligation. So again, don't take the blanket statement, I don't need a Saudi presence. It depends. Another thing to be aware of in Saudi Arabia is that you cannot bring in any kind of Israeli commodity or product. And sometimes people say, well, what does that matter? I don't care. I don't, deal with Israel. Sometimes geographically, I've had clients say, you know what, I want to warehouse it in Israel because I've got a manufacturing facility there. I've got favorable terms on a warehouse. I've got a co-packer there, whatever it might be. Saudi Arabia will not let those types of products into Saudi Arabia. And that doesn't differentiate or doesn't discern between whether it's manufactured in Israel or it's just warehouse or it transits Israel, comes up I'm so embarrassed now if Israel is near the Suez Canal. Americans obviously are very poor with geography. We just know the continental United States and that's about it. But basically, if you were to import it at a port in Israel and then transload it to a truck or to plane, whatever it might be, Saudi Arabia would refuse entry of that product. So I say that to A, be aware of it, and B, you may need to, as I talked about in the very beginning from my experience in industry, you may need to talk with your supply chain and help them figure out additional suppliers or additional shipping routes to get product into Saudi Arabia without going through Israel. The Saudi Arabian Standards Organization, SASO, is unique because it's mainly responsible, or it's responsible for production, as you see here, of a wide range of standards in Saudi Arabia. But it's not a governmental agency. It functions as a government agency in practice, but it's not part of the Saudi government. It's a third party. It's kind of like, I'm not going to say in the United States, OSHA, but OSHA is a federal agency. NIOSH in the United States, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They tend to put out standards for example, how much of a particular substance you can inhale over an 8-hour period. That could be called a TWA, a time weighted average, or they put out exposure limits for how much you can have over a given period of time, how much you can be exposed to. NIOSH would be a loose parallel to SASO in Saudi Arabia. They make standards and they propose them, but they are not part of the government. But essentially in Saudi Arabia, they are, because SASO is tasked with coming up with these standards, and then the Saudi government, and I don't mean this to be demeaning, simply says, okay, now it's part of the national law. They just delegate that to an area that they think or they know is much more technically competent than the authority might be. And then when you're talking about importing commercial chemicals, you see here, Ministry of Commerce and Industry is the one that you'd want to go before and have that conversation with. Also in Saudi Arabia, the one you're going to really want to focus on is the third article of the specific law, the Law of Chemicals Import and Management. And that's going to give you, again, similar to how we saw in Egypt, that list. Here it's only 6 instead of 7, but that third article of that law is going to show you who the ministries are who, again, will at least assert jurisdiction over your product, and what the areas that they believe they have jurisdiction for. So make sure, again, definitely looking, when you're looking between, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, for example, I could take 3 minutes and come up with probably several different examples of chemicals or situations where you might have to notify both authorities in that case, instead of just the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Similar to what we saw before, Article 2 of the law talks about the fact that chemicals may not be imported without obtaining a permit, nor may they be cleared by customs without a clearance permit. So the first part, chemicals may not be imported without obtaining a permit, pretty straightforward. Can't bring a substance into the country unless you've got a permit. So yeah, well, let's just leave it at that, because then the second part talks about nor may they be cleared by customs without a clearance permit. So if you say, well, for example, I want to bring this into a bonded warehouse at a certain port in Saudi Arabia and have it stay there, customs will not clear the product into the bonded warehouse without a permit. So it's not just moving it from the customs port of entry into the country as well. It's actually storing it in the bonded warehouse at the customs port of entry. You need to have a permit as well for that. Just wrapping up Saudi Arabia very quickly, chemicals that are imported require a license, and it's from the Ministry of Commerce. I just say A because that's the fact, and B because you may not think of the Ministry of Commerce as having jurisdiction compared to some of the other ones over the license for your chemical substance, but they certainly do in this case. You see Ag and Water have some additional requirements as well. Saudi Arabia has no inventory of chemicals and does not have a new notification scheme. As you see the bullet point under there, they clearly say in the regulation, in fact, any chemicals not subject to the Ministries of Interior and Health shall not be refused release, shall not be refused import into the country, as long as the information and documents are complete. That's interesting because they say in those particular examples, there's going to be a presumption, as we call it in the United States, that the product can come into the country. The default is not, no, you can't bring the product into the country, except when they're subject to those two ministries, Interior and Health. The presumption is that you can bring the product into the country, which is something we don't usually see. Usually it's, show me it's on the list, show me you've done the import paperwork, show me it's, whatever it is. This is a little bit more permissive. Now, also be clear that when I go back to the Saudi Arabia does not publish an inventory of chemicals and doesn't have a new chemical notification scheme. I said in the beginning, yes, but. And remember, I highlighted Saudi Arabia as a yes, but. You see here, there are 2 cities in Saudi Arabia that have their own regulatory systems in place when it comes to chemical management. So there's the overarching country regulations for Saudi Arabia, but there are 2 specific cities that have a Royal Commission Environmental Regulations group established, and it's abbreviated RCER, as you'll see, in those countries, that does specifically talk about chemical management in those 2 countries. Whether you're manufacturing, whether you're importing, whether you're transloading, whether you're warehousing, whatever it might be, in those countries, you are subject to RCER. And again, as I think I touched on in the beginning, RCER talks about having its own safety data sheet requirements. So remember I said no safety data sheets required in Saudi Arabia unless you're doing in these 2 cities, product labeling specific to these 2 cities, and a chemical inventory system specific to these 2 cities. So I'll get a phone call, hey, let's go into Saudi Arabia, have a chemical inventory. No. Okay, thanks, I'm ready to import. No, wait. Depending on the cities, there are actually chemical inventories. So the short answer is always no, Saudi Arabia as a whole country does not. But in this particular case, they do. They talk specifically about those documents. They have to be in Arabic and English. Remember I said earlier, you could have Urdu or English. In Pakistan here, they require both Arabic and English. I don't know why they require English as well, but definitely both in place. Their chemical inventory, to be clear about it, they track chemical inventories or chemical substances at particular facilities, but it's not an inventory the way TSCA is, for example. It's not a pre-notification requirement. I'm coming into one of these 2 cities. Is it okay if I manufacture or import? You need to track it at your facility in those 2 cities. And as you see here, under the requirement, you have to keep an inventory of your substances that went to see if it exceeds 50 kilograms for highly toxic chemicals in a calendar year and 5,000 kilograms for other chemicals. And you see the specific type of information that you need to keep, again, for those 2 cities. And they require an annual report of the inventory. So it is a chemical inventory in the sense of for example, if you have a warehouse and you're making widgets and you take inventory of the warehouse widgets, it's how many widgets. And for those of you that are not American, I just realized that I apologize. That's a generic American slang term for just some type of product. It doesn't matter what type of product it is. It's just a term for a random type of product. So if you're taking inventory of your number of widgets in your facility, that's what you need to report to the Royal Commission if you exceed those two amounts. Not necessarily where you imported it from or get permission ahead of time. You just need to report the inventory based on the criteria that you saw above. And then finally, wrapping up Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has always made pesticide regulation a priority, and that's nothing other than a statement of fact in the country. You can go back here, read at your leisure what requires an import license. If you're talking about agricultural pesticides, ag pesticides generally take 1 to 2 years, including a field trial for registration, and the field trial has to be done in Saudi Arabia. The reason I call that out is people say, well, I got this new pesticide product. I want to bring in Saudi Arabia, and obviously the two questions I wanted to know when I was in industry, and then the question I get two questions I get asked most as a consultant is how long and how much? And then of course, what are the requirements, but how long and how much? And that's what they tell you in essentially in the statute, or actually from conversations with the authority, 1 to 2 years. That includes the field trial, and the field trial, as I said, has to be done in Saudi Arabia. So if you have field trial data from the United States, our experience is they're not going to allow that. You need to do it in Saudi Arabia. Years ago, I used to do work in China talking about toxicology testing for aquatic tox testing in China. And I apologize, with my focus now being the Middle East and Central and South America, I haven't looked at China recently, but the Chinese requirement at the time used to be you had to do the tests in a Chinese lab on Chinese, in that example, fish species. And I don't know if that's still the case, but it's a loose parallel to Saudi Arabia requiring this to be the case. Law of Chemicals Import and Management, Section 5 gives you the information you need on containers, type, size, color, labeling, all that good stuff. Pay attention there. Saudi Arabia has not implemented GHS, but it does require a safety data sheet for hazardous substances. And again, I apologize, this is cut off. You'll have the citation for that where you can find out if it's a hazardous substance. But it does not need to be a GHS safety data sheet. You can choose to provide it in the form that is best for you, but it doesn't have to be a GHS safety data sheet. And then finally, just wrapping up 3 future opportunities and challenges. Looks like we're doing okay on time here. In December of 2019, the GCC member states, again, they're defined for you, but the ones we looked at in the beginning, agreed to implement GHS in their respective countries by the middle of 2020. As we all know, COVID-19 just put everybody on their head and turned everybody's world upside down. So that's on hold right now. We don't know. We haven't heard. It's because kind of we're still in maybe the tail end, hopefully, of COVID-19. There hasn't been any discussion as far as when that's going to move forward. But as I said earlier in the presentation, when it comes to the GCC, remember they have to implement the national legislation, implement the GCC rules into their national legislation. So let's just say July 1st, they pass the regulation at the GCC level. Process in certain countries could take up to 3 years. So the regulation could be there hypothetically by the GCC on July 1st, 2021. It won't. I want to be clear. I have not seen that anywhere. But as an example, you may not have a country then putting it into force for up to 3 years, possibly to July 1st, 2024, if not later. So again, nothing in place, but just keep in mind it's not immediate. Second future opportunity talking about is Pakistan has been talking, and again, this is something that COVID has turned upside down and we don't have a timeline for it right now. A national chemicals management policy, which would include a chemical inventory, chemical notification scheme in Pakistan. They had identified that the Ministry of Climate Change would be the competent authority when this was going forward. They were going to have a draft document at the end of 2020. That, again, didn't happen for various rules. But they have clearly identified in what they have drafted, they haven't submitted it yet, but what they have drafted is that they would include the National Chemical Inventory, which I said a moment ago, and an adoption of GHS, which was supposed to come in 2023, and certainly probably not going to happen at this point by that time frame. But just know that Pakistan is thinking about a national inventory and adoption of GHS. And then one thing that they did, which if you've had a chance to hear me talk about the Mexico chemical inventory, back in 2012, Mexico initially went into commerce in Mexico and said, okay, what chemicals are used widespread in commerce in Mexico? And they came up with a list of about 5,600 chemicals that were just in commerce in Mexico. And that's where the inventory kind of stopped, and it's supposedly ramping up again, but they came up with this list. In 2020, that's basically what the ministry did in Pakistan, worked with industry to come up with types of chemicals used in industry in Pakistan. You see some of the main issues there, or the main industries that are big in Pakistan: pulp and paper, textiles, ceramics. They went to them and said, what are you using? They compiled a list, the authority did, but there's no guidance right now what if anything, that list will mean. Will those be permitted? Will they be already grandfathered in? You know, who knows what that means? And I don't think the authority knows, to be fair to them at this point, what it means. And then finally, restrictions on RoHS or on hazardous substances, RoHS in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, I get called probably once every 2 weeks. You know, what's going on with RoHS in Saudi Arabia? I've heard it started, I heard it stopped, I heard it started, I heard it stopped. And I always say, whatever you've heard, you're right. And I say that, you know, I guess to try to be silly, but RoHS in Saudi Arabia starts and stops and starts and stops and starts and stops for different reasons. And depending when you ask me, I'll either tell you it's going on, or it's stopped, or it's likely to start up, or whatever. Just know that right now in Saudi Arabia, they do not have a RoHS regulation in place. People will tell you they do. They do not have one formally implemented. They have a draft, and they say, okay, here are the things. You see the bullet points here, things that it will apply to, but they don't have a formal inventory in place. They have a RoHS regulation in place. Once they do publish it in their national gazette, their Federal Register, their European journal, from the time that they publish it, companies will have 6 months to comply with it for new products. Please make sure you understand that. For newly produced products. You see the bottom line here. Products that do not comply can complete a sell-through period of 1 year after publication. So if you have, just again, say it gets past July 1st, if you have product in your warehouse right now that is not compliant with the regulation, if it were to be passed on July 1st, you have a sell-through period of 1 year for those products that are not compliant. So you can clean out your warehouses, you can clean out store inventory, you can clean out manufacturing facility inventory, whatever it might be. So you have that 1 year sell period. But anything brand new you need in that example, and again, it's not going to be July 1st, but in that example, anything newly made after July 1st needs to comply with the RoHS regulation. That's all we have now. We're just about spot on time. And every time I see a new slide, I feel so embarrassed. I don't know what the internet did. I'm blaming the internet because it's never happened before. Did to upload the files. But again, everything will be perfectly sorted when I send you the files later today. My contact information is there. If you want to take a look, I believe through Amazon, you can read a couple pages or maybe even a chapter on the chemical regulation in the Middle East. Again, I designed it to be very user-friendly and to be something that's very accessible to a lot of people that just want to quickly know what are the safety data sheet regulations in Bahrain. You can just open to the Bahrain section, find that subchapter. There you go, have everything to hand. So at least take a look at it online, I would think, and maybe hopefully get some good information out of it. So thank you very much, and I'll send the information out to us later today.